They would tell it for years afterward at every dinner in the riding, how the Duke of Renwick handed his mistress into the first carriage on the gravel sweep at Renwick Hall, in the long gold light of a midsummer evening, with half the county's coachmen looking on, and then turned to his wife of 5 years and told her, in a voice pitched to be overheard, to ride in the second carriage with the maids. It was the night of the Lord Lieutenant's ball at Aberton, the great event of the whole summer, the one gathering to which every family of consequence for 40 miles had been bidden, and the 2 Renwick carriages stood ready on the sweep in the evening light, the first a gleaming thing of black lacquer and the Renwick crest picked out in gold, drawn by the 4 matched bays that were the envy of the county, the second a plain, serviceable closed carriage of the sort a household keeps for the servants and the luggage. The Duke gave his arm to Mrs. Vaux, the fashionable widow who had been so much at the hall that spring, and handed her up into the crested carriage with a care he had not shown his own wife in the whole 5 years of their marriage, and settled the skirts of her gown. And then he looked across the gravel at the Duchess, standing dressed and ready in the last of the light, and he said, "You will follow in the second carriage. Isabel, Mrs. Vaux is my guest. It is only proper she ride with me. You will not mind the plain coach. You are so fond of the horses after all." He did not raise his voice. That was the practised cruelty of the man. He never needed to. The whole sweep heard it. The coachmen on their boxes, the grooms at the horses' heads, the footmen by the door, and the whole sweep went very still. The particular stillness of servants who have witnessed a thing they must never be seen to have witnessed. And Isabel, Duchess of Renwick, looked for a long moment at the crested carriage with the widow already smiling inside it, and at the 4 beautiful bays stamping in the traces, and then she looked at her husband, and she did the one thing against which there is no reply. She obeyed him. She crossed the gravel to the second carriage, the plain one, and let the footman hand her up into it among the folded cloaks and the maids who did not dare to meet her eye, and she settled herself on the hard seat, and she said not one word. The Duke, satisfied, gave the order to drive on, and the crested carriage went down the avenue first, with its beautiful horses and its smiling widow, and the plain second carriage followed after, as he had commanded. But at the great gates of Renwick, where the drive met the Averton road, the way divided, left for Averton and the ball, right for the open country and the long road home. And the Duchess of Renwick leaned forward and spoke quietly to the coachman through the front glass, and the plain second carriage did not turn left toward Averton with the crested one. It turned right. It turned for home, and it carried her the whole long way back through the summer dusk, and she rode in that second carriage every mile of it with her hands folded and her face composed, and she did not go to the ball at all, and she did not, in any way that mattered, ever come back. Not to that marriage as it had been, not as the woman who would cross a gravel sweep to a plain coach because her husband told her to. If you have ever been put in your place in front of people who suddenly found the sky very interesting, if you have ever been ranked second, out loud, to someone with nothing to recommend them but the fact of being new, and told it so pleasantly that any protest would have made you the villain of the piece, then you already understand the composure with which Isabel rode that second carriage home, and you know it was not surrender. It was the last clean thing she could do, and she did it without a tremor. Stay with me, if you will, because this is not the story of a woman sent to the servant's coach and forgotten. It is the story of a proud man learning, one empty stable and one silent house at a time. Exactly what he had handed away on that gravel sweep. And before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and if you find yourself coming back for stories of quiet women and the men who learned their worth too late, then you know already what to do. Now let us go back, because a plain carriage is only wood and springs, and to understand why a whole county talked of nothing else for a season. You must first understand what Isabel was, and what the Duke had made of himself long before he ever met her. She had come to him, as such wives so often do, folded into an arrangement. Isabel's people were the Hartleys, an old name grown poor, land rich and coin starved, and the marriage had married the Duke's fortune to the Hartley blood, in the tidy way these things are done, without anyone troubling to ask the 19-year-old girl whether she would have chosen it. She had not wept about it. She had come to Renwick with her plain trunks and her quiet manner, and she had found, in the one place at the whole great cold estate that had any warmth in it, the thing that would make her, not a drawing-room, not a still-room, but the stables. For Isabel Hartley had been raised on a poor estate where a girl who wished to ride had to learn to gentle and school her own mounts, there being no money for a horse already made, and she had a gift for it that amounted very nearly to genius, a quiet hand, an endless patience, and an eye for a horse's mind that the roughest groom and the proudest breeder alike came, in the end, to defer to. When she married Renwick, the ducal stables were a handsome ruin, good blood gone to waste under a stud groom who drank and a master who bought fashionable and never followed through. And within 3 years Isabel had made them the talk of the North. She it was who had bred and broken the 4-matched bays that drew the crested carriage. She who trained them to that famous floating trot. She who sat up whole nights in the straw with a mare in a hard foaling, and came in grey with exhaustion and would not go to bed until the foal was standing. The horses that half the county envied, the horses that were, that very evening, drawing the Duke and his widow down the Averton road in such style, those horses were hers, every one, root and branch, and the man who put her in the second carriage did it, though he never once thought of it, behind the very animals she had made. It had not come easily, and it had not come quickly, and no one who saw the finished stables at their height ever guessed the labour buried under them. When Isabel first came to Renwick as a bride of 19, the stables had been a scandal in their own quiet way. A long handsome range of boxes going to rot, good blood standing in dirty straw, a stud groom named Cobbett who drank the horse liniment when the ale ran short, and schooled the young ones with a whip and his fists, so that the yard was full of animals that flinched when a hand came near them and reared in the traces and had been written off, one after another, as bad-tempered and useless. Isabel had gone down to that yard on her 3rd morning at Renwick, in a plain gown, because she could not sleep in the cold grand house, and the horses were the only company in it she understood, and she had watched Cobbett bloody a 2-year-old's mouth, trying to force it past a gate that frightened it, and she had said, quietly, "Stop." And Cobbett had laughed at her, a merchant of horses' pain, who had never been checked by anyone, least of all a girl. And Isabel had gone to the Duke, this was in the first weeks, when she still imagined she might reach him, and had told him plainly that his stud groom was ruining valuable animals and must go, and the Duke had looked at her with the cold, faint surprise of a man whose furniture has spoken, and had said that Cobbett had been in the family's service 20 years, and that the stables were hardly a lady's concern. And Isabel had said nothing further. She had simply, over the next 6 months, without any drama and without any leave, begun to undo Cobbett's work in the hours he was drunk, gentling the flinching 2-year-old with a handful of oats and an endless patience, sitting on an upturned bucket in the box for hours, doing nothing but letting it learn. She would not hurt it, until the animal that had been written off as vicious was following her round the yard like a dog. When at last the colt that everyone had given up sold for a sum that made even the Duke's steward blink, and it came out that the girl had made it, quietly, in the ruins of Cobbett's cruelty, the Duke had dismissed Cobbett without a word to her about it, and had let Isabel have the yard, less because he valued her than because it was plainly profitable to do so, and Isabel had asked for nothing more, and had taken the one warm thing Renwick had given her, which was a free hand in the stables, and had built her whole life quietly inside it. The Duke knew none of it as a thing to be grateful for. He knew the stables were suddenly excellent, and he took the credit for them at his club without a flicker, and he believed, in so far as he considered it at all, that a duke's stables were simply excellent as a matter of course, the way his cellars were good and his shooting was good, by the natural operation of being a duke. That the excellence had a name, and the name was his wife's, and the hands that made it were the same hands he had watched grow chapped and hard with work. This had genuinely never presented itself to him as a fact requiring notice. It is a particular blindness, and it is not stupidity. It is the blindness of a man to whom the world has always been arranged, who cannot see the arranges because he has never once had to be one. His coldness, though, had a source, and to be fair to him, for this is not a story about a monster, but about a man, the source ran deep and old. When the Duke of Renwick was 9 years old, his mother had left. She had left in the night, with a lover, an army officer with a laughing face and nothing to his name, and she had left her husband and her small son to the mercy of the county's talk, and the county had not been merciful. The boy had grown up in a house made of that scandal, raised by a father who had been publicly, catastrophically shamed by a woman's conduct, and who had determined that his son should never suffer the same. A father who taught him, as though it were the first article of a creed, that to love a woman was to hand her the knife she would one day use on your name, that affection was the soft place through which the wound comes, that the only safe way to hold a wife was at arm's length, ranked below you and reminded of it, so that she could never rise high enough to disgrace you when she fell. The boy had learned the lesson to the letter. He had grown into a man who kept every woman he knew, and above all the woman he married, in a place of studied inferiority, not from hatred, but from a terror so old and so deep he no longer knew it was there, the terror of the 9-year-old listening to the carriage wheels go away in the dark. He remembered the night his mother left more exactly than he ever let anyone know. He had been 9, and he had woken to the sound of the carriage on the gravel. Not the smart, daytime sound of an arrival, but the muffled, guilty sound of wheels being walked quietly out in the dark so as to wake no one. And he had gone to the window in his nightshirt and seen the lamps of it moving off down the avenue. And he had known, in the way a child knows the shape of a disaster before he has the words for it, that his mother was in that carriage and was not coming back. He had not called out. He had stood at the cold glass and watched the 2 small lamps grow smaller and turn at the gates and vanish, and he had listened until the wheels were gone entirely. And then he had gone back to his bed and lain there dry-eyed, and something in him had closed like a door. In the weeks after, he had watched his father, a proud man, a hard man, become a figure of the county's pity and the county's talk, had watched him flinch at every drawing-room, had heard more than once the small musical laughter of women who found the abandoned husband a diverting subject, and the boy had drawn from all of it a single iron, ruinous lesson, taught to him openly by a father who believed he was giving his son armor, that a woman you allow near your heart is a woman handed the power to make you, in front of everyone, a fool, that the wheels always, in the end, go off in the dark, and that the only safety is never to hold a thing so near that its leaving can be seen to wound you. He put his wife in the second carriage, in the end, for the same reason he did everything, because a woman who rides behind you cannot leave you first, because a woman kept below you cannot be seen to have thrown you down, because a 9-year-old at a cold window had decided, listening to the wheels, that he would rather never be loved than ever again be left, and had never once, in 30 years, examined the decision, or noticed that in making it he had condemned himself to the very loneliness he had been so frightened of. Here is the wound within the wound, the thing that made the gravel sweep cut so deep. Isabel had begun to hope. In the last year, something had been shifting between them, so slowly that she had hardly dared to name it. He had taken to coming down to the stables of an evening, at first to inspect in his cold way, and then, increasingly, simply to be there, leaning on a loose box door, watching her work a young horse in the last light, saying little, but there. He had asked her once, awkwardly, to teach him what she looked for in a foal, and had listened to her answer with an attention he gave to almost nothing. He had begun, once or twice, to say our horses instead of my horses, and on one extraordinary evening in the spring, when a colt she loved had colicked, and they had walked it together between them through half the night to keep it from casting, the Duke of Renwick had stood in the grey dawn in the stable yard, with straw in his hair and his fine coat ruined, and had looked at his wife across the saved colt's back with something naked and astonished in his face, and had almost said a thing, and had not, and Isabel had gathered that almost, and the our horses, and the evenings at the loose box door, into a small hope she showed to no one, because she knew, being no fool, that a hope displayed to Renwick was a hope placed exactly where he could most easily crush it. And then Mrs. Vox had come with her town gowns and her flattery that asked nothing of him and returned everything, and the Duke had felt the old terror stir, had felt himself beginning to want his own wife, to be at the soft place, to be 9 years old and listening for the wheels, and he had done what his father had trained him to do with any woman who came too near. He had put her behind him. He had put her in the second carriage. There had been that spring one evening in particular that Isabel had folded away and kept and taken out in private more than once to look at, the way a careful woman looks at a thing she is half afraid to trust. A dealer had come up from the south, a hard, knowing man with a great reputation, to look at the bays with an eye to buying the whole team for a marcus, and he had walked round them a long time in the yard saying little, and had then turned to the Duke and said, bluntly, in the way of men who buy and sell for a living and have no patience with rank, that he had not seen 4 horses matched and made like that in 20 years, and that whoever had schooled them had a gift he would pay a great deal to have in his own yard, and that it was plainly no common groom. And the Duke of Renwick, who might have taken the compliment for himself as he always did, had stood a moment, and then had said, Isabel could still hear exactly the tone of it, "My wife made them. Every one. From the ground." He had said it evenly, without warmth, a plain statement of fact, but he had said it, in front of the dealer and the grooms, and he had named her, and Isabel had gone on quieting the young horse at her hand, with her face turned away, so that no one should see what one plain sentence had done to her. It was not much. She knew it was not much, but she had been given so little for so long that a little went a great way with her, and she had added it to her hoard, our horses and the evenings at the box, and now this, and had let the small forbidden hope grow another inch in the dark, and that was precisely why the gravel sweep, when it came, cut down to the bone, because he had shown her, in front of witnesses, that he could name her worth aloud, which meant that when he ranked her below a stranger in front of witnesses, he had chosen to. The cruelty was no longer possibly an oversight. He had proved he could see her, and then he had looked straight at her and put her in the second carriage anyway. The consequence of that he had not remotely foreseen. He arrived at the Averton ball with Mrs. Vaux on his arm and turned, in the crowded, blazing entrance hall, to present his Duchess to the Lord Lieutenant, and found no Duchess. The plain second carriage had not arrived. It did not arrive at all. And the Duke of Renwick was obliged to stand in the most public room in the county, under the eyes of every family that mattered, and account for the absence of his own wife, and he could not, because he did not know where she was. And the not knowing spread across his face before he could stop it, and the county saw it, and the county understood, with the terrible swiftness of a crowd that scents a story, exactly what must have happened. By morning, it was everywhere. The Duke of Renwick had sent his wife to the servant's carriage in front of the coachman, and the Duchess had ridden it home and refused to come at all, and had let her empty place at the Lord Lieutenant's ball speak for her louder than any scene could have. There is no scandal in the world so loud as a dignified absence, and Isabel had contrived, without lifting her voice or her hand, the loudest that the county had heard in 20 years. The stables told the rest of the story, in the weeks that followed, more plainly than any drawing-room could. For Isabel did not stay at Renwick. She went with 2 grooms who would follow her into the sea, and her own mare, and the young horses she was in the middle of making, to a small house on the Hartley land that had come to her free of the settlement, a modest place with a paddock and a range of loose boxes, and she set up there, quietly, as a woman who breeds and schools horses, and within a month the buyers who had used to come to Renwick for their carriage teams were driving instead to a small house on the Hartley land, because everyone in the north who knew horses knew, whatever the settlement said, whose hand had made the Renwick bays. The Duke came down to his own famous stables one grey morning, and found them a handsome ruin again already, not from any malice. She had taken nothing that was not hers, and left his own animals well and fed. But the intelligence had gone out of the place, the ordering mind, and a colt she would have caught going wrong at the second week was 3 weeks wrong before anyone noticed, and the great yard that had been the talk of the county stood there full of good blood, and no one who understood it. He walked the empty boxes she had ruled, and he began slowly, the way a man tests a broken tooth, to see the size of the thing he had put in the second carriage. The buyers made it plainer to him than anything else could have. Within the month, the letters that had used to come to Renwick asking after a carriage team or a hunter began instead to come addressed, a little awkwardly, to the small house on the Hartley land. And when the Duke, stung, made some remark at his club about upstart yards and the fickleness of buyers, an old horse-breeding baronet he had known all his life looked at him over his port and said, not unkindly, Renwick, everyone in the north knows whose hand made your bays. We were buying the Duchess all along. You were merely the address. And the Duke had gone home and sat a long while with that, the truth of it settling into him like cold water into ground, because it was exactly and unanswerably true. He had been for 5 years an address. The worth had been hers, the name on the gate had been his, and he had contrived to insult the worth and keep the name, and now the worth had simply changed its address and left him holding an empty gate. He rode past the Hartley place once, that autumn, meaning only to look, and had seen from the road the yard full and busy, a string of good young horses being led out in the low light, and his wife at the centre of it, all giving quiet directions, alive and thriving and complete, with a shape to her life that plainly had no Duke-sized hole in it anywhere, and he had turned his horse and ridden home the long way so that no one should see his face, and had understood, finally and to the bottom, that she had not been diminished by leaving him. He had been diminished by being left. It was the exact lesson of his childhood delivered back to him in his 40th year, and this time there was no one to blame for the wheels going off in the dark but himself, who had told them to drive on. He read her training notes for a long time, that first grey morning in the empty yard, the sheets she had pinned up in her clear hand for the grooms she trusted, this colt to be walked over poles until he stops rushing his fences, this filly not to be hurried. She is clever and will do it all if you do not bully her. This old mare to have her feed damped. She has lost a back tooth and no one has troubled to notice, and he read them the way another man might read letters from a woman he had lost, for the mind in them, the patience, the particular tenderness toward frightened things that ran under every line like water under grass. He noticed, reading, how often the word frightened appeared in her notes, and how she never once wrote that a horse was stupid or vicious or bad, only that it was frightened, and had learned to hide the fright behind temper, and must be taught slowly and without punishment that it need not be afraid. And something turned over in him, reading that some cold stone he had carried so long he had forgotten it was not part of him. Because he understood, dimly at first and then not dimly at all, that she had been describing, without knowing it, the whole method by which a living creature is kept, and that it was the exact opposite of the method his father had taught him, and that he had been, all his life, a frightened thing, hiding the fright behind coldness, and that no one had ever taught him slowly and without punishment that he need not be afraid, and that his wife might have given a chance if he had not sent her to ride behind him. It was his great-aunt who made him feel it, because the seeing and the feeling are two different educations. Lady Honoria Renwick was 80 if she was a day, and had buried a husband and 2 sons and every illusion she had ever owned. And she came to the hall unannounced when the story reached her, and found her great-nephew in the stable yard of all places, standing among the idle boxes, and she did not sit down before she began. "So," she said, "you have contrived to lose the only remarkable thing that ever came into this family, and you have done it, if I understand the reports, over a seating arrangement.
Your grandfather lost his wife to an officer with good teeth and no money, and it broke him, and it made your father into the fool who raised you to be this. And you had a wife who did not run, Marcus, who stayed, who made your name worth something in a horse country that respects nothing else. And you have taught her to run with your own hands.
Because a widow with a fan told you it would flatter you to rank your Duchess below her. I am too old to be gentle with you. You were not put in a carriage behind your mother. Your wife has done nothing your mother did. And you have punished her for 25 years for a crime she never committed, and now you have driven her off exactly as your mother was driven off, and had the gall to be surprised. She let that stand a moment. You do not have your father's excuse, she said. No one shamed you. You shamed yourself in front of the coachman on a fine evening for nothing. The child finished what the old woman began. His name was Tom, and he was 9, the son of the Duke's dead cousin, a ward of the hall, a boy who lived for the horses and had spent every hour Isabel would permit him at her elbow in the stable yard learning what she knew. He found his guardian one evening in the empty tack room where the Duke had taken lately, to sitting for no reason he could have named among the idle bridles, and Tom asked him the question that undid the last of his composure. He did not ask it to wound. He asked it because he was 9, and it was the thing he needed to know. "Uncle, when is Aunt Isabel coming back to the horses? Because Bright Star is going wrong in his off hind, and she's the only one who can feel what it is." And the new man just shouts at him, and she never shouted. She said, "You can't school a frightened thing by frightening it more." And when the Duke did not answer, the boy looked up at him with the plain, clear eyes of the young and said, "Did you send her away?" "Grigson says you sent her to ride in the servant's carriage. Why would you do that? She's the best of us. She's the best of anybody." And then, because he was 9 and merciless in the way only an honest child can be, "Doesn't she know you like her? You do like her, don't you? Because if you never told her, then she'd think you didn't, and then why would she stay?" And the Duke of Renwick, who had watched his mother's carriage go without letting his face move, and had buried his father dry-eyed, sat among the idle bridles and found he could not, for a long moment, answer a boy of 9. "No," he said at last, "I never told her." And Tom nodded as though a great many things had just been explained, and said, "Then that's why," with the awful simplicity of a child stating a law of nature, and went back out to the horses she had left. Isabel, meanwhile, was not pining. That was the thing that reached him and reshaped him more than any lecture. The reports that came back, carried by the grooms, by Tom, who walked the miles to the Hartley place whenever he was let, were not of a wronged woman waiting to be sent for. They were of a woman thriving. A small yard full to the boxes with good horses and buyers on a waiting list, and a life that plainly had no shaped hole in it where a duke ought to be. She answered his letters. He wrote to her, first on the pretext of some matter about the settlement, then about a mayor's papers, then at last, with the pretext worn through, about nothing at all. And she answered every one. In her clear, even hand, precisely and completely, and with not a single word of warmth nor of reproach, a perfect courtesy that was colder than any anger. And she declined, with the same courtesy, every crooked hint that she might come home, until he understood that he would have to say the thing straight, and say it where he had wronged her, in the open, at the cost of the pride his father had taught him to guard above his own happiness. Mrs. Vox, for her part, made the Duke's education easier by playing her hand out to its shabby end. She had understood the second carriage as a victory, and she came often to the hall that summer to enjoy it. And she made the error, at a public breakfast at Averton, of laughing about the absent Duchess within the Duke's hearing. A bright little remark about horses and stable yards, and how some women were really more suited to the mews than the drawing-room, and how one could always tell. The Duke heard it. He heard all of it, the practised laugh, the flick of the fan, the pleasure some people take in making an absent woman small. And he heard it now with the ears of a man who had walked the empty boxes and been flayed by his great-aunt and gutted by a boy of 9. And something in him that had leaned a long while finally went over. He did not shout. He was a Renwick. He crossed the terrace to Mrs. Vox in front of the whole Averton breakfast and said, in the same even voice he had used on the gravel sweep, but turned now to its opposite purpose, "You are speaking of my wife, madam, of the woman whose hand made every horse that this county pretends to admire, including the 4 you rode behind so pleasantly on the night I disgraced myself. She has forgotten more of what is worth knowing than this table will ever learn, and I will thank you not to speak of her again in my hearing." And into the appalled silence he added the sentence that went round the riding by nightfall, "I put my Duchess in the second carriage, and I have discovered since that I have spent 5 years riding behind her without the wit to know it. The mistake was mine. It was always mine. It cost him, and he knew the cost to the farthing, every eye on him, half of them delighted. A man raised to guard his name above all things, making himself deliberately the subject of every dinner in the county. He paid it, and found he did not die of it, and found underneath the burn of it the same strange relief a man feels who has carried a heavy thing too long, and is at last, in front of everyone, allowed to set it down. And word of it went to the Hartley place, as everything did, carried by Tom, who reported the whole scene to Isabel in the stable yard with the round-eyed satisfaction of a born chronicler. She listened, standing at a young horse's head, and she went on quieting the horse with one hand. And she said nothing that Tom could carry back. But that evening she wrote the Duke a note, the first that was not about papers or mares, and it said only, "You may call on me tomorrow at 11, if you wish to speak of it." And the Duke of Renwick read those words more times than he would confess to anyone, and did not sleep, and stood at the door of the small Hartley house at 11 the next morning, with his hat in his hands, and no speech prepared, because he had learned at least this much of his wife, that a speech was the last thing she would forgive. What passed between them in the plain parlour of that small house was no grand reconciliation, and Isabel did not let it become one. She received him seated among the smells of leather and horse and beeswax, and she offered him tea, and she did not rise, and she did not soften. And when he began, clumsily, without eloquence, groping after words that came out bare, to say that he had wronged her, she let him, and did not help him, and did not stop him. He named it plainly, as she required, without requiring it, that he had married her without seeing her, that he had watched her make something extraordinary with her own 2 hands, and had taken the credit and given her the servant's carriage, that he had let an old terror, a boy's terror from a night 25 years gone, make a coward and a cruelty of him. He mentioned his mother only once, and not as a plea, only to say that he had let a woman who had wronged him as a child teach him to wrong a woman who never had, and that this was his failing and not his fate. His to own and his to mend, no part of it hers to bear. And Isabel, when he had run dry, was quiet a while, and then she said the thing he would carry to his grave. "I did not leave you for the insult," she said, her voice level as still water. "I have been made small before. My own mother-in-law called me a good little groom to my face at my wedding breakfast, and I schooled a 2-year-old that same afternoon and thought no more of it. My pride will survive anything you can do to it. I left because I had begun to think you might be coming to love me. The evenings at the box, the colt we saved, the way you said our horses, I had begun to hope. And then you stood on your own gravel and showed the whole county that you would sooner give a stranger my place than let me ride beside you. It is not the insult I cannot forgive. It is the hope. You gave it to me, and then you shamed it in the open, and I will not put it in your hands a second time to be broken, unless I am very sure it will be kept." She was quiet a moment, and then she said the thing that went nearest the bone of him, because she had seen it, as she saw everything, and had never once thrown it in his face until now, when it might do some good. "I know why you did it," she said. "I know about the carriage that went in the night when you were a boy, and the mother who was in it, and the father who taught you that the only safe wife is one who cannot leave you first. I have known a long while. I am not without pity for the child at that window, Marcus. I have wept for him more than once, which is more than you have ever let yourself do. But I am not that carriage, and I never was, and I will not spend the rest of my life being punished at the servants' coach for a crime a dead woman committed 30 years ago. You must decide whether you will grieve the boy at the window or go on being him. You cannot do both and keep me." And then she gave him her terms plainly, one by one, like the conditions of a sale, because a horsewoman knows that a promise is only breath, and a proven thing is the only thing worth buying. She would not come back to ride behind him. She would come back only to a marriage in which she rode beside him as a matter of course, unasked, in which her work was hers and named as hers, in which he told her, in words and not only by conduct, when she was wanted, because she had learned from a boy of 9 that a person untold will believe herself unwanted and be right to. And she would not take his word for it. "Come to me for a season," she said, "not with speeches, with ordinary days. Show me a plain life in which I have my place and keep it, and if it holds, I will come home to it. But I will not come home to a promise. I have your promises. Bring me the days." He brought her the days. That is the part no one dined out on, for there is nothing in it to relish. Only a man riding out to a small horse yard on a great many ordinary mornings through a long summer into autumn, learning to do the unremarkable things he had never troubled to do. He came, and he worked. He put off his fine coat and he mucked boxes under her direction and took her orders in the yard in front of the grooms without a flicker of the old pride. And he learned, at 40, from his own wife, the thing the boy Tom already knew, that you cannot school a frightened creature by frightening it more, and understood, somewhere in the learning, that this had been the whole error of his life, that he had tried for 25 years to keep love safe by frightening it into staying, when the only thing that keeps a living creature by you is to make it unafraid. He saved a foaling with her one grey dawn, his hands beside her, chapped hands in the straw, and stood after in the cold light with the wet foal struggling up between them, and told her then, plainly in words, at last, that she was the best thing that had ever come into his life, and that he had spent 5 years too much a coward to say it, and Isabel did not answer him. But she let her hand rest a moment over his on the loose box door, the first time she had touched him of her own will since the gravel sweep. And it was answer enough to go on with. The proof the county talked of came at the autumn horse fair at Thornby, the great sale where every breeder and dealer in the north gathered, and where the Duke of Renwick did a thing that no man of his rank had ever been seen to do. A dispute had arisen over a valuable young stallion that a southern dealer swore was sound and half the ring suspected was not, and the price was climbing, and men who should have known better were being carried along by the dealer's confidence and the horse's undeniable looks. And the Duke of Renwick, who had come to the fair at his wife's side and stood at her shoulder through the morning like a man attending a master, watched Isabel go quietly over the stallion in the press of the ring, run her hand down the off-fore, stand a moment at its head reading its eye, ask it to move and watch how it came back, and then straighten and say to him, "Lo, he is not sound. There is heat in that tendon that will break down inside the year, and he knows it himself. Look how he saves it when he turns. Do not let them buy him." And the Duke of Renwick raised his voice in that crowded ring, in front of the whole assembled horse country of the north, the dealers and the breeders and the fine gentlemen with their money out, and said, "My wife says the horse is unsound in the off-fore, and my wife has never in her life been wrong about a horse. I would not give £50 for him, and if any man here is fond of his money he will do as she says." There was a silence, and then a laugh from the southern dealer, who made the grave error of asking, sneering, "Since when did his grace take his horse sense from a lady's fan?" And the Duke looked at him and said, evenly, "Since I learned, sir, at some expense, that she has more of it than I have, and more than you, and that a wise man goes to the best judge in the room and is not particular about the judge's gown." The stallion broke down in the spring, exactly as she had said, in the off-fore, and lamed itself past mending, and the men who had listened to the Duchess of Renwick at Thornby did not forget it, and the men who had laughed did not forget it either. And the whole horse country understood at last what the Duke had been too proud for 5 years to see, that he had married the best judge of a horse in the north, and had spent those years pretending she was the second best thing in his own carriage. He rode beside her after that, and made sure the county saw it. At the very next great gathering of the autumn, at a hunt breakfast where all the families that had watched him disgrace himself were gathered again, the Duke of Renwick drove up the sweep with his Duchess beside him in the crested carriage, behind the 4 bays she had made, and he handed her down himself before the whole assembly. And when the Lord Lieutenant admired the horses, as everyone always admired the horses, the Duke said, clearly, so that no one at the breakfast could pretend not to hear, "They are my wife's making, every one. I have merely had the honour of riding behind them, which I begin to think is the natural order of things, and no shame to any man." Mrs. Vaux had removed herself to Bath by then, where a fan went further, and the story was less exactly known. It was Tom, in the end, who brought the last of it about, as a determined child of 9 so often brings about the things the grown people are too proud or too frightened to finish for themselves. Bright Star, the colt he had fretted over, going wrong in the off-hind under the new man's shouting, had got worse through the autumn, standing miserable in his box, flinching now from every hand. written off by the grooms as ruined, tempered exactly as Cobbett's horses had once been written off, and Tom, who had watched his aunt mend such creatures a dozen times, could not bear it. So on a raw morning near the year's turn, the boy did a thing both brave and forbidden. He took Bright Star's leading rein himself, and he walked the frightened, flinching colt the whole 3 miles across the frosted country to the small Hartley house, alone, because he had decided that if the horse could not go to Isabel, then he would bring Isabel the horse. He arrived blue with cold and shaking, and would not let go of the rein until Isabel came out, and the Duke, who had ridden after the moment the boy's absence was discovered, half wild with the fear of a child gone missing on a winter road, arrived hard behind him to find the 3 of them in the Hartley yard. The boy, the ruined colt, and his wife already down on one knee in the frost, with her hand flat against the horse's trembling shoulder, saying the low words Bright Star had been starving for, and the animal beginning, by inches, to unlock. And Tom looked up at his guardian and said, fiercely, through his chattering teeth, he was frightened, and nobody would stop being angry at him long enough to see it, so I brought him to somebody who would. She fixes frightened things. She'd fix you too, if you'd let her. But you have to stop being proud and come and stand still like the horse does. And there was nothing in the world the Duke of Renwick could say to that, so he did the only thing left to a man who has finally run out of pride. He came and stood still, like the horse in the frost, and let himself be seen to be frightened, and let himself be gentled. And it was there in the Hartley yard, over a saved colt and a stubborn boy, that the last cold stone in him finally, quietly dissolved. And on a bright cold morning near the turn of the year, Isabel, Duchess of Renwick, closed up the small Hartley house with her own hands and came home, not sent for, not fetched, but come. On her own terms and by her own decision, bringing her horses and her grooms and her whole thriving concern back to the great yard that had been dying without her. She was not the woman who had crossed the gravel to the second carriage. That woman had ridden away that midsummer night and never returned, and Isabel was glad of it. In her place came a remade one, who had priced her own worth out loud and in the open, and would not be ranked below anyone ever again. The carriage became, in the years that followed, the family's private legend, and it became so because the Duke made it so deliberately from the first day she came home. There would be no more second carriages at Renwick. He gave the order himself, before the servants, that the crested carriage was the Duchess's carriage, and that she was to be handed into it first on every journey they made together, always as a matter of settled custom, and he kept it. For the rest of his life, on every drive they took, to church, to a ball, to a christening, to nothing at all, the Duke of Renwick handed his wife up into the first carriage with his own hand before he took his place beside her. And there were those who thought it a small, eccentric ceremony and did not know the story, and there were those who knew the story and were quietly undone by it every time they saw it. There were children in time, a boy and then 2 girls, and the eldest girl had her mother's hand for a horse and would sit up the whole night in the straw at a hard foaling before she was 14. And the story passed into the family's account of itself, told and retold on winter evenings. The story of the midsummer night the Duke put the Duchess in the second carriage, and how she rode it home and never went to the ball at all. and how he then spent a year and the whole of his father's cold creed learning to hand her into the first carriage every day of his life instead. Tom told it best when he was grown and had a yard of his own on the Hartley land that his aunt had helped him to. He had been there for the worst of it and the mending of it both, and he never lost his relish for the turn where the plain carriage went right at the gates instead of left. He would set it out for the children with a horseman's care, the two carriages on the sweep, the crested one and the plain one, the 4 bays she had made stamping in the traces, the widow smiling, the even cruel voice, and he would bring them to the edge of it. The moment their grandmother crossed the gravel to the servant's coach and let herself be handed up without a word. And then, just when the little ones were sure they knew how it ended, a proud man and a cast-off wife. He would tell them how the plain carriage came to the gates in the summer dusk and turned, not left toward the ball and the whole watching county, but right toward home and the open country, and how that one quiet turning of the wheels had said, without a single raised voice, everything that needed saying. And then he would tell them the true ending, which was not the turning at all, but the year that came after it, the empty stables, the old woman's tongue and the boy's stubbornness, the cold morning in the frost when a frightened man learned at last to stand still and be gentled like a frightened horse, and he would finish always the same way, that a person's worth does not ride in the second carriage no matter where you seat them, that it goes where they go, and that the only cure for a man fool enough to send it away is to spend the rest of his life learning to hand it up into the first carriage with his own hand and mean it every single time. And Isabel, hearing it told again down the long warm table, would only ever say the one dry thing, setting aside whatever she held and looking at the man who had learned at such cost to see her. "He sent me to the second carriage once," she would say on a fine evening in front of the coachman, "for a widow with a good fan. And he has spent the rest of his life handing me into the first. Taking the long view of the account, I find it very nearly balances. And the Duke of Renwick, beside her, always beside her now, never before nor behind, would laugh, which was a thing he had not done in all the guarded years before she taught him how, and would take his wife's hand there at the table where everyone could see, and would tell her, in plain words, and not by conduct only, exactly how much she was wanted. Because he had learned from a boy of 9 that the thing must be said aloud, or it does not count, and from a horsewoman that you keep nothing living by frightening it, and that a creature, a colt, a wife, a whole late-mended heart will stay of its own accord only where it is made unafraid, and told plainly and daily and for the rest of a man's life that it is wanted and prized, and never again to be sent to ride behind.